I knew something was wrong the second Mason Reed started sniffing around our personnel files like a dog with a bone. Look, when you've been doing cybersecurity for 15 years, you notice things. The guy was pulling employee records at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, going through compensation data for what he called legacy personnel. That's corporate speak for anyone over 45 who remembers when handshakes actually meant something. My name's Garrett Stone, 48 years old, and I've been keeping bad guys out of computer systems since before these MBA types knew a password from a paperclip. Mason didn't realize I could see every move he made on our network. Amateur hour, really. Here's the thing about working for a defense contractor. Everything leaves a trail. Every email, every file access, every late-night fishing expedition through employee data. I wasn't surprised when I found Mason's digital fingerprints all over the HR system. The guy moved through our internal networks like he owned the place, which would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. You know what really got me? Half his brilliant restructuring ideas were just rehashed versions of security systems I'd built 3 years ago. Back then, I suggested a zero-trust security model that could cut our vulnerability risks by 60%. He dismissed it as overcomplicated, old-school thinking. Now he was repackaging the same concept as adaptive security mesh and presenting it to the board like he'd invented the wheel. I kept my records clean and my documentation current. You don't survive 15 years in defense contracting, especially as a Navy veteran, without covering your bases, legal, technical, and otherwise. Mason strutted through our facility like he had the keys to Fort Knox. Every time he mentioned cost optimization in meetings, I noticed his spreadsheets lingered a little too long on my department's budget. Not the network guys, not the system administrators, cybersecurity architecture, my area. The thing is, Mason didn't understand how deep my work went into our infrastructure. He saw architect on my job title and probably thought I drew pretty diagrams. What he didn't realize was that my security protocols weren't just protecting company emails, they were safeguarding entire defense contract specifications, including client-specific encryption that required continuous monitoring. Pull me out of the picture and the whole security chain wouldn't just break, it would collapse like dominoes through legal, client operations, and federal oversight. One of our major contracts was with a Pentagon subcontractor. I'd signed security clearances so classified they required polygraph tests every 2 years. My wife Sarah always joked that those sessions were harder than our marriage counseling. It would have been almost professional if Mason wasn't being so reckless. He thought he was trimming fat from the payroll. What he was really doing was cutting the main power line. He didn't understand the system architecture, and I could tell the moment he started asking HR about inactive contract renewals that he thought he'd found an easy target. He thought mine was one of them. There was one problem with his plan, though. Apex Defense Solutions didn't hire idiots for their legal team. At least one paralegal, Hunter Davis, had been around long enough to remember when I personally flagged a security issue with how contract clauses were stored in our system. That clause, the one Mason was pretending he hadn't seen, it had teeth. Real teeth. If HR failed to deliver an updated contract by a specific date, and if I didn't get proper notice of that update being delayed, every piece of equity and performance bonus tied to my name would mature immediately. No waiting periods, no performance reviews, no nothing. But see, here's the real kicker. I never wanted it to come to this. Sarah and I had been talking about maybe taking early retirement in a few years, buying that little place up. In Vermont, we'd been eyeing. I didn't hate the company. The work was challenging, and honestly, I even enjoyed some of the chaos that comes with defense contracts. But Mason turned what should have been a professional relationship into a hunting expedition. He looked at my quiet work style and saw weakness. He looked at my gray hair and saw obsolescence. He looked at my name on his cost-cutting spreadsheet and thought, easy win. All I had to do was wait and watch, keep doing my job, keep my mouth shut, and let Mason dig his own grave. Then came the company holiday dinner. I asked Brooke Williams from HR if my contract renewal had come through yet. She smiled that professional smile. Oh yes, we sent it last week. Mason said he'd walk it over to you personally. I set down my fork real careful-like, straightened my napkin the way my Navy training taught me to keep my hands busy when I'm thinking. So I guess he didn't mention why he's been sitting on it. You know that moment in the movies when the record scratches and everything goes quiet? Yeah, it was exactly like that. By the second week of January, the office felt like a pressure cooker with the safety valve taped shut. You didn't need a security briefing to know layoffs were coming. Mason had started using his favorite phrase in every meeting, value optimization. He said it with this smug confidence like he'd trademarked the concept. You could watch him calculating who built what and how fast it could be handed off to some cheaper contractor or AI system. Then the whispers started. I overheard Brooke from client operations mentioning that Mason had asked how much of our cybersecurity setup could be moved to an outside team with lower overhead. Not if it could be done, just how quickly. I was polite when I asked her to forward me that email thread. She hesitated, probably wondering if she was getting herself in trouble, then did it anyway. The word legacy showed up 3 times in that conversation, once in bold. Same day, legal sent me a message on our secure system. Nothing dramatic, just Preston Ward asking, "Can you confirm if Section 6B is still tied to your job title or to actual work output?" Sounded innocent enough, but I knew better. Legal doesn't go digging through old contract clauses unless someone higher up tells them to. And someone only tells them to do that when they're setting up a termination. So I blocked out my weekend and went through my employment file line by line, every word, every comma, every clause and attachment. Sarah brought me coffee around midnight Saturday and asked what I was doing. "Just checking something," I told her. "Honey, you've been at this for 6 hours. What's going on?" I showed her the retention clause, Section 6B, buried on page 34 of my original contract from 2019. She read it twice, then looked at me with those eyes that said she knew exactly what I was thinking. "How much?" she asked. "If they trigger it?" "About $4.2 million. She sat down hard in the kitchen chair. Garrett. $4.2 million. It's not just the original equity. There's this multiplier thing tied to successful projects. Every time one of my security systems helped land a contract or prevented a breach, the value went up. They've been feeding this thing for 5 years without realizing it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "So what are you going to do?" "Nothing. That's the beauty of it. I'm going to do absolutely nothing except my job." The retention clause wasn't buried in some forgotten filing cabinet. It was right there in the digital files, clear as day. Mason just hadn't done his homework. Or maybe he figured a guy like me wouldn't know enough about contracts to matter. On Monday morning, I ran into him in the hallway. He had those wireless earbuds in, probably listening to some podcast about disrupting workplace efficiency or whatever these guys consume for breakfast. I kept my voice level. "You planning to restructure the cybersecurity side of things?" He pulled out one earbud like I was interrupting something important. "Not specifically," he said, using that polished corporate tone they teach in business school. "But yes, we're evaluating legacy positions across the board. Nothing's set in stone." There was that word again. Legacy, like we were expired milk in the back of the fridge. I nodded professionally. "Just make sure HR stays in the loop. Some of the older contracts have specific notification requirements." "Of course," he said, already reaching to put his earbud back in. "Section 6B needs formal acknowledgement if there are any changes." That got his attention. His head tilted just enough to show me I'd said something he didn't quite understand. "You mean that old retention clause? That's the one." I saw something flicker in his eyes, like he remembered the clause existed but couldn't quite place why it mattered. I didn't explain it to him. Let him figure it out, let him wonder. He didn't know I'd already made a copy of the clause, highlighted the important parts, and dropped it off with my lawyer over the weekend. Not because I was paranoid, but because I believe in being prepared. That's the difference between guys who've been around the block and guys who think they invented the wheel. One side writes strategic plans, the other side reads the fine print. Mason thought he was cleaning house, getting rid of dead weight. What he didn't understand, what nobody ever tells these fast-track executives, is that some of the dead weight is actually holding up the whole building. You remove the wrong support beam and everything comes crashing down. But sure, let's optimize. Let's talk about value. I could wait, because by the time they figured out what Mason had overlooked, the damage would already be spreading through the system, and there wouldn't be a thing anyone could do to stop it. The company holiday dinner was at some overpriced steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where they charge $60 for a piece of meat and call it an experience. Mason held court at the far end of our private dining room, telling some story about quarterly metrics like he was Moses delivering the commandments. I sat a couple seats down from Brooke Williams, our HR director, nursing a club soda and watching Mason perform his one-man show. Sarah had wanted to come. Spouses were invited. But our daughter Emma had a basketball game that night. Just as well. What was about to happen wasn't really a family-friendly moment. The conversation around the table was the usual corporate small talk. Cue, two projections, client updates, someone's Peloton class getting canceled. Normal stuff. Then Brooke leaned over to me with that professional smile. So Garrett, did you get your contract renewal? Simple question. Innocent on the surface. Like she didn't already think I was probably on the chopping block. We sent it out last week, she continued. Mason said he'd hand deliver it to you personally. That was the moment, the fork in the road. I could have smiled, could have nodded, could have said, oh great, I'll check my desk. Instead, I set my fork down carefully, the way my Navy training taught me to control my movements when things are about to get interesting. So I guess he didn't tell you why he's been holding on to it. The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind you get between courses. This was the real deal. Dead air. You could have heard a pin drop in that noisy restaurant. Brooke's smile didn't just fade. It vanished completely. The guy next to her stopped mid-sentence about something. Across the table, Mason's jaw tightened just enough that I knew he'd heard me, even though he was pretending to be deep in conversation with someone else. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. I just reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out an envelope I'd prepared that morning, and placed it on the table between the dessert menus. Nice paper, my signature in blue ink, dated and witnessed. I won't be renewing my contract, I said, effective immediately. The envelope did the rest of the talking for me. Mason reached for his wine glass, then thought better of it. Too early for liquid courage, too late for damage control. And here's the thing that probably bothered him most. He still didn't know what he'd just stepped in. Not yet. But Brooke knew. You could see it in her eyes. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it. Her gaze went from Mason to me to that envelope like it was radioactive. The room didn't explode. It imploded. Someone coughed. Someone else grabbed a dinner roll like that would make things normal again. The head of product development quietly scooted his chair a little farther from Mason. Smart guy. Mason cleared his throat and tried to salvage the situation. Let's not be dramatic here, he said with this tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I looked straight at him. I'm not being dramatic, that's more your style. Then I went back to cutting my steak. 1 bite, 2 bites. Nobody else picked up their silverware. There's a certain kind of power in staying calm when everyone else is losing their minds. The kind that makes people realize they're watching a train wreck in slow motion and there's nothing they can do to stop it. The worst part for Mason? He still had no clue what Section 6B actually meant. He didn't know what was coming next. But I did. And by morning, everyone else would too. By 8:07 the next day, I'd already deactivated my own access to the company systems. Not them, me. Clean log out, auto reply activated. This mailbox is no longer monitored. Simple as that. Mason didn't notice until his morning staff meeting. He asked Hunter from our DevOps team why a security patch hadn't gone live yet. Because Garrett's access codes are locked down, she told him. And he didn't leave the deployment keys before he left. Mason blinked. We'll figure it out. That's when legal showed up. 2 guys from compliance walked into his office before lunch with folders in their hands and faces like they'd just opened Pandora's box. One of them, Preston Ward I think, had a sticky note on his folder that just said 6B confirmed. Mason actually laughed when he saw it. Come on, that old clause. That was from before the last restructuring. No way that's still valid. Preston didn't laugh. It's absolutely still binding. The original contract was never amended. Mason's face went through about 3 different colors, but he didn't give notice. He can't just quit and expect he didn't need to give notice. You suppress delivery of his contract update. That counts as non-renewal without proper documentation. That's when it hit him. Mason leaned back in his chair like someone had punched him in the gut. He's bluffing. There's no way we actually owe him anything. But there was. See, back in 2019 when nobody was paying attention to retention, clauses for senior technical people, they'd given me leverage. Section 6B was crystal clear. If a contract update gets suppressed or not delivered with proper records, all stock grants, loyalty payouts, and performance bonuses convert to immediate payout. The magic number, $4.2 million in actual shares, not some maybe someday performance bonus. Real money. Liquid assets. Mason was scrambling now. He can't prove I didn't deliver it. Brooke spoke up from the doorway. She'd been standing there the whole time, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Actually, he can prove it. He asked me directly at dinner. Mason opened his mouth to say something, then realized he couldn't. Not when half the room had heard exactly how I'd phrased it. Not when HR had logged it. Not when two other department heads were sitting at the same table. He slumped in his chair. Fine. So it's enforceable. Can't we negotiate something? Work out a settlement? Preston shook his head. The clause doesn't include any mitigation language. You missed the window, Mason snapped. This is insane. We can't just hand over $4.2 million because of some paperwork technicality. Preston's response was ice cold. It's not a technicality, it's a contract. You're the one who didn't read it. Outside Mason's office, the rumors started flying. Only this time, people weren't wondering if layoffs were coming. They were wondering what other things Mason had screwed up. I wasn't there to see any of this, by the way. I was sitting in a coffee shop across town, reading the news on my laptop and thinking about how Sarah and I could finally afford that place in Vermont, maybe get a boat for the lake, take Emma on a real vacation instead of those weekend camping trips we'd been doing to save money. They thought my silence meant I was weak. Turns out silence is just a loaded weapon, and mine had just gone off. By day 3, the CFO looked like he'd been living on coffee and antacids. I wasn't there to witness it personally, but word travels fast in the defense contracting world. Accounting got pulled into what they started calling the crater. Mason demanded a full review of my equity package, looking for any way to minimize the damage. There has to be a way to reduce this, he kept saying, pacing around the emergency finance meeting like a caged animal. He wasn't even a VP. He didn't manage people, which was true. I didn't manage people. I managed the systems that made half their jobs possible in the first place. The problem wasn't just the $4.2 million base amount. Section 6B had language most contracts don't include, a performance multiplier tied to successful projects. Every time one of my security systems helped land a contract or prevented a breach, the total payout went up automatically. And the vesting schedule that had been spread across multiple product launches? Mason had never bothered to understand how that worked. It compounded faster than he'd ever imagined. Meanwhile, the real damage started showing up where Mason had never thought to look, with our clients. Our biggest client, North Point Defense, sent an email with the subject line, "Continuity assurance required." That's military contractor speak for prove your house isn't on fire. Their CTO wanted a full breakdown of backup plans for the optimization systems I'd built over 4 years. Systems that weren't just code, they were adaptive frameworks tied to real-time logistics and contract compliance. Mason tried to bluff his way through it, sent back some corporate nonsense about seamless internal transitions. North Point's response was brutal. We'll be holding all pending contract extensions until this is resolved. Translation: no new money until you tell us who's going to replace the guy who actually kept your systems running. Day 4 brought another client crisis. Westfield Defense paused their Phase 2 integration. Same reason, same silence from our end. Then came the internal email that started the real avalanche. Someone in sales accidentally sent a message to the entire operations team. If Garrett's out, are we renegotiating all the SLAs? Nobody replied to that email. Mason didn't even try to respond. Because the second someone answered that question honestly, the House of Cards would become a formal liability report, the kind that investors pay attention to, the kind that gets attached to quarterly reports and scares away funding. The CFO made one last desperate attempt to push back on the performance multiplier, but legal shut that down fast. The clause was airtight, the milestones were documented, and every timestamp was legally sound. Only one thing left to do: cut the check. That same day, a recruiter I knew from Titan Systems sent me a text. "Heard you're available. We need to talk." I smiled, not because I wanted revenge, but because word travels fast when the person they tried to push out ends up being the person they can't replace. Titan didn't need to check my references. They'd been watching Apex Defense's public contracts for years, and they knew exactly where my fingerprints were on every successful security implementation. Their CTO got straight to the point during our meeting. "We've been following your work for years," she said. "That constraint framework you built for the Westfield project? Game-changing stuff." I shook her hand and didn't bother correcting her assumptions about my background. I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes it's better to let people draw their own conclusions. They offered me a position on the spot. Strategic cybersecurity consultant, partner track, 7-figure equity package. No probationary period, no performance reviews for the first year. just an outline of what I'd be working on and an invitation to help them compete against companies like Apex Defense. Meanwhile, back at my former employer, things went from bad to worse. The COO, Colton Hayes, broke protocol and sent me a personal email. Subject line, "Let's talk. Garrett, this situation is getting out of hand. We'd like to reset expectations and find a constructive path forward." I didn't reply, my lawyer did. She thanked them for reaching out, confirmed that I was no longer associated with the company, and attached a summary of Section 6B with all the relevant dates and deadlines. Then she added a polite but firm note: any further communication should go through legal channels. Colton replied the next morning with one sentence: "Would you consider a settlement agreement?" They attached terms: $2.8 million with a non-disclosure agreement. I didn't even think about it, declined immediately, because a payout with strings attached was exactly the kind of band-aid solution Mason would have suggested. And I wasn't about to sell back the respect I'd earned fair and square, through every ignored suggestion, every stolen idea, every legacy system comment tossed around like it was nothing. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted what every working man deserves, to be treated with dignity and to have my contributions recognized. And now I had both. Titan gave me complete autonomy over their new security architecture project. I named the system Athena, after the Greek goddess of strategic warfare. Seemed fitting, considering how Apex Defense had just provided me with the perfect case study in corporate strategy. In my first week at Titan, I walked past a glass-walled conference room where two project managers were discussing system architecture. One of them looked up and said to the other, "That's him. That's the guy who built the framework Mason couldn't replace." They didn't say it loudly, but they didn't need to. My reputation had arrived before I did. I never updated my LinkedIn profile, never made any public statements about what happened at Apex Defense. But in the defense contracting world, word gets around when someone who was supposed to be dead weight ends up being irreplaceable. The final chapter came about a month later. Sarah and I were having dinner, takeout Chinese on a Tuesday night, nothing fancy, when she showed me an article from Defense Industry Weekly. Apex Defense Solutions faces client retention challenges, following senior personnel changes. The article didn't mention me by name, but it didn't need to. Anyone in the industry could read between the lines. "So," Sarah said, setting down her chopsticks, "how does it feel?" I thought about it for a minute. How did it feel? Honestly, it felt like justice. Not the dramatic movie theater kind of justice, but the quiet, everyday kind that happens when preparation meets opportunity and patience pays off. "It feels like I can finally afford to take you and Emma on that vacation to Europe you've been talking about," I said. She laughed. "Garrett Stone, you are the most practical man I've ever met. That's why you married me. That's one of the reasons. We used part of the settlement money to buy that house in Vermont. Nothing flashy. 3 bedrooms, a dock on the lake, enough space for Emma to bring friends when she visits from college. The rest went into investments in Emma's education fund. Mason, from what I heard through the industry grapevine, got reassigned to Director of Special Projects. Corporate speak for we can't fire him because of his contract. But we're never letting him near anything important again." His corner office became a shared workspace near the break room. His calendar went from back-to-back meetings to mostly empty blocks. I didn't take any satisfaction in his downfall, honestly. The guy made his own bed by not doing his homework and underestimating people he should have respected. But here's what I learned from the whole experience, and it's something I tell younger guys in the industry now. Your reputation isn't built on the loudest voice in the room or the flashiest presentation. It's built on showing up every day, doing good work, and treating people with respect. Mason thought corporate success was about optimization and efficiency and cutting costs. What he didn't understand is that success, real, lasting success, is about building something that can't be easily replaced. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding the most important piece of the puzzle. 6 months later, Titan Systems landed the biggest defense contract in company history. The client specifically requested me by name to lead the cybersecurity architecture, not because I was the loudest or the flashiest, but because I was the one who understood that security isn't just about keeping bad guys out. It's about building trust that lasts. I kept my Vermont house, my family, my dignity, and my professional reputation. Mason kept his expensive suits and his MBA vocabulary. I know which trade I'd make again in a heartbeat. You know what they say about patience being a virtue? Sometimes it's also a strategy, and sometimes the best revenge is just being too good at your job to ignore. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any company isn't the one shouting orders from the corner office. It's the quiet professional who actually reads the contracts and remembers every detail. Real power doesn't come from having the fanciest title or the loudest voice. It comes from being so good at what you do that removing you would cost more than keeping you ever did.